Every so often, a gaming news outlet produces something so unintentionally comedic that you sometimes wonder whether it's actually satire. And this week, The Gamer has stepped forward with an article so spectacularly out of touch, it must be written by an individual who hasn't spoken to a normal human being since before lockdown. Apparently, the quiet disappearance of a minor Game Awards category from the yearly corporate farce, one most people couldn't name under the threat of death, is being considered by them as a tragic cultural loss. Reading it, you can practically hear the writer clutching a lace handkerchief while whispering, "Why won't anyone care about this list of corporate diversity managers?" All while at the same time, past nominees from this same class were very publicly insisting that the Game Awards should be repurposed as a platform to, get this, talk about Palestine, demanding that Jeff Keighley halt the show, dim the lights, and deliver a somber monologue about Gaza. So today we're going to take a gentle, slightly amused wander through what was once known as the Game Awards future class. Not because it mattered, but because the gaming news outlet known as The Gamer truly, desperately needs it to have mattered. More importantly, we'll examine why some people are behaving as though the Nobel Peace Prize is no longer up for grabs, because the outrage doesn't reveal any profound injustice. It reveals the uneasy truth that the performative identity theatre that many have relied on for cultural leverage is losing its audience, and the only thing they're genuinely mourning is the slow, humiliating realisation that their influence is evaporating faster than the Game Awards ever cared to pretend it wasn't. I am Lady Decade, and if you'd like to hear all of the spicy gossip from the games industry, then hit that subscribe button, because this is why gaming journalists are erupting with outrage at the Game Awards. And it's every bit as petty and desperate as you might imagine. The modern games press has developed a bizarre little habit of convincing itself that every minor corporate initiative was some profound cultural milestone. They cheer on every new release that arrives, draped in slogans about representation and empowerment. The press, publishers and consultancy class have become part of a racket, a sort of egregious moral pyramid scheme where every title has to be sanitized to suit their doctrines and worldviews. But thankfully, not every part of gaming has lost the plot. There are still studios out there making games with heart and soul, and even better, I know where you can find them for next to nothing. Use my links to grab massive discounts on Final Fantasy Tactics: The Evilise Chronicles, Silent Hill F with 42% off, Stellar Blade with 39% off, and thousands more. Because if the AAA world insists on treating us like wallets with thumbs, we may as well outsmart them and play something made for fun rather than empty applause. Now, to understand why today's topic has become a talking point, we should start with the stage it lived on. The Game Awards has, for better or worse, become the biggest circus in gaming, a glossy, bombastic marketing festival where Jeff Keighley stands proudly at the centre, like a very enthusiastic ringmaster, queuing up world premieres, celebrity cameos, and orchestral renditions of games most viewers still haven't played. It's gaming's equivalent of the Oscars, if the Oscars were 90% adverts and occasionally interrupted by a Fortnite skin. And because the Game Awards evolved into this highly corporate fiasco, it ended up adopting the same compulsive habit every entertainment event developed in the late 2010s. Loudly proving that it was on the right side of history, even if nobody asked. And that's where the future class came in. The Game Awards' shiny new initiative introduced in 2020 to showcase what it branded as a bright, bold and inclusive future of video games. On paper, it was the sort of thing that would make a certain type of LinkedIn user burst into tears of joy. A curated list of visionaries and changemakers presented with the kind of soft-focused language you normally find in corporate wellness brochures. It was designed to look modern, to sound progressive, and to signal that the Game Awards was perfectly in sync with the cultural moment of 2020, a year when even Greggs was tweeting about social justice. Every brand was racing to rebrand itself itself as a moral authority. Within that climate, the future class fits right in. It was highly photogenic, wonderfully vague, and perfectly engineered for a 2-minute inspirational montage, complete with orchestral strings and captions about the next generation. According to its own messaging, it would spotlight underrepresented talent, offering networking opportunities, cultivate mentorship pipelines, and essentially position these individuals as the vanguard of gaming's evolving landscape. And what was really crazy was, despite the fact that everyone knew that the Game Awards was a bit of a farce, some people genuinely embraced these participation trophies. The initial reception was glowing because the industry, particularly its media class, was desperate to believe that real structural change was finally happening. Journalists applauded it, and certain types of influencers celebrated it. But of course, that moment has passed. The hashtags stopped trending, the industry moved on, and nobody seemed to notice that the future being hyped up in 2020 had quietly been shoved in a storage cupboard somewhere else. Updates slowed to a crawl, and the dedicated web page for it began shrinking like it potentially owed someone some money, and eventually the whole thing simply vanished. In fact, if you weren't paying attention, you wouldn't even know that it ever existed. But the truth of the matter is, the future class wasn't some grand engine of change halted in its prime. It was never more than a time-specific branding exercise that fulfilled its purpose in the moment that the cameras stopped rolling. So, through this lens, its disappearance isn't shocking. What's shocking, though, is the fact that the gamer is still writing elegies for it in 2025, long after the rest of the world has moved on. Game journalist Jade King, who wrote the article, would give thoughts on the future class, commenting that, as someone who works within this industry, it was a worthwhile way of both celebrating my peers and connecting with new talent, not to mention how often it included many BIPOC and queer folks who otherwise wouldn't receive mainstream recognition like this. It was a brave highlight within a show that so often was dominated by corporate practices. How very stunning, how very brave. They would also add that the future class was initially introduced to highlight talent in an industry where so many voices are unrepresented, and in doing so connect them with a new community, job opportunities and more. It was a valiant cause that in its first 3 years, at the very least, seemed to be viewed quite positively. Future Class was an uplifting initiative with admirable goals, so much so that I wanted to nominate not only friends but people in the industry around my age who deserved more recognition. Due to the fact that the writers seem to have wanted to use this farce to help platform their friends into perceived positions of power, the article treats the end of the future class with all the gravity of Rome collapsing into the sea. As if this glossy little pandemic-era PR exercise marked the beginning of some enlightened new age rather than what it so obviously was, a flimsy, algorithm-approved trinket from a very, very brief cultural moment when corporations pretended to care about your identity because it made the quarterly reports look compassionate, all while quietly calculating how much they could squeeze out of you in the process. Unsurprisingly, once the cultural moment had passed, so did the Game Awards initiative. After its disappearance, even the alumni seemed baffled. One day they were listed as the future of the industry, and the next they'd been Thanos snapped out of the brand's identity. Still, out of those who had won the so-called Game Awards, a few felt confused that the initiative ended, a few felt they hadn't gained anything from it, and several realised they were essentially invited to a photo shoot, not a mentorship programme. One alumnus described the long-term impact of the future class as a Discord server which is unintentionally poetic. Nothing represents corporate commitment to progress like being dumped into a group chat with strangers and no follow-through. And that's the truth. The initiative didn't collapse because of injustice or betrayal. It collapsed because it was never built to achieve anything. It was an optics branding accessory, something created to make the show look socially conscious during a specific cultural wave. And once that wave receded, the initiative shrank and the updates dried up. And the facade evaporated exactly the way you'd expect it to, from something created for presentation rather than purpose. As for Jeff, the man who leads the awards, he isn't some kind of activist, a mentor, or a spiritual guide of gaming's next generation. He's the ever-smiling, ever-neutral host of a giant marketing spectacle, a man who has somehow mastered the rare skill of being enthusiastically passionate about complete corporate bullshit. His entire livelihood depends on maintaining good relationships with every major publisher on the planet. The award show is built on spectacle. Raw, industrial strength spectacle, the kind that pulls in millions of viewers and sells sponsorship slots and convinces publishers that announcing a logo at Jeff's show is worth more than any press conference they could organise themselves. The Game Awards is essentially the Super Bowl of game marketing. Except the halftime show is just 3 minutes of explosions, followed by someone announcing a remake, and there's nothing wrong with that particularly. People tune in because it's a giant hype machine, but does that mean the show's priorities are less uplift their so-called underrepresented voices and more, can we get Keanu Reeves to say something meme-worthy again? In that ecosystem, the future class never stood a chance. You can practically imagine the internal pitch deck, trailer reveals, check, celebrity cameos, check, publisher partnerships, check, a vaguely defined mentorship scheme that generates no revenue and no hype. Yeah, that bullet point isn't making it past slide 3, is it? The Game Awards thrives on adrenaline, not accountability. It rewards the glossy surface of the industry, but not the dull administrative underside where mentorship programs live and die. So, of course, it got shelved. Of course the website disappeared. Of course nobody announced a new cohort. It was the equivalent of placing a potted plant on the Formula 1 track and then being shocked when it doesn't survive the first lap. And this is where the wider industry context becomes almost comical, because if there's one thing American AAA gaming excels at, it's putting on gigantic self-congratulatory spectacles while quietly abandoning every value those spectacles loudly claim to stand for. This is the same industry that will chant diversity matters during a live stream and then lay off half its staff in January. The same industry that will produce a trailer about elevating new voices, then stick its next generation of talent in a Discord server and forget to turn on notifications. There's nothing tragic about this story, it's a predictable one. And the fact that The Gamer is writing about it like an empire has fallen tells you everything you need to know about how outdated their ideological lens has become, and its removal is a sign of how completely the ideological climate of the industry has shifted. Over the last few years, we've seen a very clear trend. Companies rolling back DEI commitments, studios quietly retiring diversity teams that were created during the 2020 cultural panic, and audiences overwhelmingly rejecting moralistic branding in favour of, well, games that are actually good. In fact, surveys show that upwards of 90% of players now prioritise quality over messaging. The Overton window has moved, and it hasn't moved in the direction that The Gamer wants it to have moved. The outlet is essentially mourning something the public has already mentally filed away alongside NFTs and the metaverse. The positive push of identity politics is seen by most as a dying trend from a different era. It's also worth noting that cynicism isn't rising because people are jaded, it's rising because people are paying attention. But this is all just a part of the story, as apparently we need to talk about Gaza as well. Recently, the so-called future class walked headfirst into a political firestorm that no corporate PR department on earth was ever going to touch, because in late 2023, the future class alumni, the very people the Game Awards had platformed, chose to draft an open letter demanding that the Game Awards take an explicit geopolitical stance on Gaza, describing the situation as genocide, calling for a public statement of solidarity and urging Jeff Keighley to break his carefully curated neutrality live on air in front of millions of viewers. And just to be clear, this wasn't a mild or symbolic request, it was a direct demand for one of the most sponsor-sensitive industry-entangled events in gaming to wade into one of the most emotionally charged and internationally contentious political conflicts of the century. Now, here is where it gets even more telling. Less than half of the future class members signed the letter. and several openly refused, with one going so far as to describe the letter's claims as misinformation and one-sided. Suddenly, this supposedly unified cohort of the industry's future was very publicly splitting along ideological lines, and instead of representing progress or harmony or anything remotely photogenic, the future class was now at risk of becoming a full-blown political liability, not for some edgy indie collective, but for a show whose entire existence depends on appearing safe, neutral, and sponsor-friendly. And this is where Jeff Keighley's role becomes almost comically clear, because Jeff isn't an activist, a reformer, or the spiritual voice of gaming's next generation. He is a professional hype curator whose livelihood depends on maintaining immaculate relationships with every publisher on the planet. This is a man who once removed Activision from the show in the wake of the 2021 harassment scandal, only to admit later that the removal was actually a joint decision between Activision and us. A phrase which, translated into normal human language, means nobody was actually punished and both sides agreed on the optics. Jeff doesn't take moral stances unless the corporations involved have pre-approved the messaging in a colour-coded Google Doc. That is a level of neutrality that we are dealing with here. At the end of the day, the Game Awards is just about making money, right? So the optics are only going to be important if Jeff Keighley thinks that it's going to result in making more money. Imagine just for a moment the Future Class alumni sending that Gaza letter to him, a loose coalition of young creatives suddenly demanding that he jump on stage, stare down the camera and deliver a passionate political statement in the middle of a show bankrolled by Amazon, Activision, Microsoft, Tencent, Sony, Bandai Namco and every other multinational conglomerate with a shareholder sensitivity level somewhere between skittish and permanently terrified. There is no universe in which Jeff Keighley would ever risk that. He wouldn't risk it even if there were no sponsors at all. This is a man who avoids controversy the way people avoid drinking bleach. And so the moment the Future Class became a political pressure group rather than a decorative slideshow, it became a liability. And the moment it became a liability was the moment it became terminal. It was retired because the initiative had mutated into exactly what corporations fear most: a group of people acting under their brand name without their permission, expressing political demands they cannot control in a climate where even one poorly worded sentence can trigger international outrage. The moment the Future Class dipped its toes into the Gaza conflict, the countdown began. So the initiative wasn't abandoned, it was euthanized. And the funniest part is that while all of this was happening, the cultural tides were already turning. The Overton window has shifted so dramatically that even the public, who were once expected to clap for every diversity announcement like seals at feeding time, had started making their priorities clear. Surveys now show that more than 95% of gamers consider inclusivity messaging less important than game quality. Studios across the Western entertainment landscape have been quietly rolling back their DEI departments, and audiences are increasingly vocal about wanting actual competence instead of moral theatre. It's not that people turned against diversity, it's that they stopped believing corporations ever meant any of it in the first place, because the reality is that they didn't. And anyone with half a brain already knew this. When you lay all of the information out side by side, the Gaza letter, the corporate panic, the cultural shift, the decline of DEI as a branding tool, and the stark contrast between symbolic activism and tangible contribution, the story becomes incredibly simple. The article treats the loss of it like a Shakespearean tragedy, yet the Future Class was never designed to build the future, it was designed to decorate the present. And once a decorative value expired, the whole thing was quietly placed in the recycling bin, where all corporate trends eventually do go. And that brings us to the inevitable question: what did people expect to happen? Because the more you look at how this initiative played out, the clearer it becomes that the Future Class was never designed to propel anyone into stardom. And this is where the article is unintentionally hilarious. It imagines a chorus of objections, arguments about platforms, follow-ups and long-term mentorship, as if any of this was ever part of a serious organisational plan. The Game Awards is a massive marketing event. Its job is to generate hype, celebrity moments, and publisher goodwill, not to run a permanent career support program for people chosen because they fit a diversity brand strategy in 2020. The idea that Jeff Keighley should become everyone's career manager is adorable, but it's also ridiculous. His entire world revolves around keeping megacorps happy enough to drop exclusive trailers on his stage. The Future Class was incompatible with that reality from the moment it launched, and pretending otherwise is how you end up writing overwrought think pieces about a PR initiative that was destined to vanish. So here's the simple truth. The future of gaming was never going to emerge from corporate initiatives designed for blue sky applause. It's going to come from the people who actually do the work, the creators, the developers, the modders, the volunteers, the ones shaping the medium, trying to make games people actually want to play when the cameras aren't rolling and the hashtags aren't trending. Never get distracted by who ends up in a montage, but instead pay attention to who's actually building things. And don't forget that you can use my links to grab a massive discounts on Final Fantasy Tactics, the Ivalice Chronicles, Silent Hill F with 42% off, Stellar Blade with 39% off, and thousands more. Or if you want a break from modern releases altogether, why not check out my upload on the ridiculous Star Trek console over on Lady Arcade. Or if you really want to support me in a more personal way, you can access my behind the scenes cosplay library and more by becoming a backer over on Patreon. I'll see you all again very soon.